My heart clenched with pain as I watched Jean cry at our kitchen table. My wife's fiery red hair hung down like a shroud, and her shoulders jerked with loud, full-bodied sobs. In a dozen years together, I'd never seen her sob like that. I'd never seen her grieve like that. Not when her best friend was diagnosed with cancer. Not when she had a miscarriage. Not even at her mother's funeral. I realized there was only one thing that could make her cry like that. My heart was breaking, but not for her. It was breaking because of me. I said in a monotone, "James is dead." Stunned by my sudden appearance, she looked up at me, her emerald green eyes widened with shock and fear. My wife realized that she was now facing two tragedies. The first was the death of her greatest love. The second was the fact that her husband had finally and irrevocably realized that he had never been first in her heart. Her sobs came out again, overwhelmed with fear and pain. She held out her arms to me. Whether she was asking for comfort or asking me to comfort her, I didn't know or care. "Scott." "Okay." Turning on my heels, I left our house without further ado, haunted by her hopeless, piercing scream. I got behind the wheel of the car. I always did that when I needed to think. Running might have served the same purpose, but I knew my ruminations would last longer than my condition allowed. Hell, they'd probably last longer than the bones in my legs. James was Jean's boyfriend, in high school and then college. They had known each other since they were kids. Their parents and friends knew they were going to get married, but they didn't. He wanted to be the Hemingway of the 21st century, traveling the world, experiencing adventures and bringing them to life in his works. Marrying Jean did not fit into those plans. James's need to make his own way in the world was stronger than his desire to marry her, and he left her. His rejection broke Jean's heart, but by the time I met her 3 years later, she seemed to have recovered. I had no indication that there was anything left in her heart but love for the man she had known all her life. She and I dated and quickly fell in love. My wife was a gorgeous woman, tall and athletic, but also the quintessential feminine. If her dreams had gone in that direction, she could have easily become a model. Instead, more than anything, she wanted a loving husband and a happy family. When we were dating, James was hardly ever mentioned in conversation, and certainly not more often than any of my exes. Perhaps that should have been a clue. She'd known him for 15 years. He should have been more prominent in anecdotes about her childhood. It hadn't occurred to me at the time. Now the gap made me wonder what else I had missed. We'd only met a couple times. The first time was at our wedding, where I was told he was invited as her childhood friend, not her college sweetheart. His parents were old family friends and were also invited, but that didn't confuse me. What surprised me was how different James and I were. I was brown-haired, tall, and slender, with the body of an endurance athlete, earned by long hours of running and playing tennis. He resembled a firefighter, short, powerful, with unruly black hair. Jean was a few centimeters taller than him. However, it wasn't just the physical difference that separated us. He exuded a cheerful, down-to-earth personality filled with roguish charm, while I was much more reserved and, if anything, solid. Some might even say boring. I wouldn't say I was cocky, but I wasn't looking for trouble either. I immediately disliked James, and he obviously had the same feelings about me. Even if it wasn't for the lovely Ginny becoming a bone of contention between us, I think we would have despised each other. He wasn't, I thought, anything special. Moderately handsome, educated, and driven, but not particularly intelligent or accomplished. By then, he had only had a brief stint in the army and a helicopter job on a large cargo ship, as well as a few other minor adventures following in his idol's footsteps. In my estimation, I surpassed him in almost every way. Then I saw Jean looking at him. When I was around, she treated him in a friendly and even sisterly way. But when she didn't realize I was watching her, I saw a longing in her that bothered me. I asked her about it, but she laughed and said it was just what might have been, and nothing more. My loving fiancé gently rebuked me for looking at an ex we once met over a cup of coffee, but I let it go. After all, she was to be my fiancé. I had won the hand of a beautiful maiden, but he had won her heart. I just didn't know it at the time. After the wedding, Jean and I plunged headlong into married life. I was happy, she seemed happy. In every way, she made me realize that she was the perfect wife, loving, caring, and passionate, a true partner. We were newlyweds and we behaved exactly like that. But the longing I saw never completely left me. It annoyed me from time to time that I had never seen her look at me like that. I tried to ignore the way she sometimes averted her gaze. When I interrupted her reverie, there was a hint of guilt before a loving smile. Of course, it's only my imagination, I told myself. Of course it was. Then he visited our home, 3 years after we were married. More precisely, he visited Jean. When I came home from work, they were sitting at the kitchen table talking quietly. I caught only scraps of their words before they noticed my presence, but their body language and the urgency of their quiet conversation made me wonder. James's hand rested on her arm, and they snuggled into each other. His face was earnest, and hers was conflicted. My anxiety increased when they noticed my presence. James pulled away from me with a smug expression on his face that was something between disdain and contempt. Jean nearly jumped to her feet and rushed to shower me with welcoming kisses. Darling, I'm so glad you're home. I see. I stared at the uninvited guest sitting at my kitchen table. He held my gaze. James? He stood up. Actually, I was just leaving. I wish I could stay, but I'm leaving early tomorrow morning. Going to McMurdo Station in Antarctica for 6 months? I didn't pretend to be sorry he was leaving, and he didn't pretend he didn't care. Jean looked around the room quickly, politely, but clearly dismissing him. You'll have to come visit us when you're back in town. I'm sorry you can't stay longer. James smiled at my wife as she pulled away, then kissed Jean's cheek and hugged her. A little too long and a little too close for my taste. Letting her go, the guy pretended he wanted to shake my hand. Scott, thank you for taking care of Jean. I can see how devoted you are to her. She's very lucky to have found her true love. His manners became almost affable, but there was something lurking behind the pleasant facade, some kind of joke. He was laughing at me. The way Jean threw up her hands, she understood the joke, but she didn't think it was so funny. I stared at him, ignoring his outstretched hand, then nodded dismissively. Have a good trip. As soon as he was gone, we started rowing away. There was more than just an old friendship between her and James. We both knew it, but she didn't want to admit it. I didn't believe Jean had cheated on me, but I couldn't get the possibility out of my head. She stared at me in silence for a while, but I knew I was right. There was some guilt in her, some indiscretion that I saw in outline but not fully. After a few days, things between us fell apart. James had left for the yacht to freeze his ass off, and we were still here. She did her best to make me forget my anger and suspicions. I loved her, and it worked. We spent the whole weekend in bed making up, and 9 months later, while trying to pull off the road, I jerked the steering wheel of my car violently and nearly flipped it over. Only by sheer luck did I not get hit by another car as I jumped out of my car onto the curb, scattering my lunch all over the sidewalk. 9 months. Oh my God. Rachel wasn't like me. She was a clone of her mother. Nathan was the same. Oh my God. Oh my God. I sat in the car on the side of the road for a long time until the sun went down. The text notifications and my wife's unexpectedly cheerful ringtone played over and over, but I barely paid attention to them. My gaze was fixed on the horizon, trying to find some balance in a world that no longer made sense. I'm not usually the most emotional person. I won't say I don't cry. In my opinion, any person who cries is either lying or emotionally stunted. But I hardly ever cry in public. By the time I got ready to hit the road, my face was flooded with tears and my shirt was almost soaked through. In the cheap motel room, I finally looked at my phone. To her credit, Jean's messages went from apology to concern to fear. There was never any anger in them. The same couldn't be said for mine. All she got in response was a simple, "Screw off." So I unplugged the phone and lay staring up at the water-damaged ceiling, wondering if I should get a divorce. Wondering how I would explain divorce to my children. Wondering if they were my children. The misery kept me awake for so long. I was exhausted and, finally, the worries and heartache were behind me for a while. I could only wish that they would not come back as soon as I woke up, that they would be nightmares and disappear in the light of the morning sun. But then, I opened my eyes again and smelled the faint odor of mold and cleaning products. I realized that the dream was my marriage, and my wife's paroxysms of grief last night were my awakening. There was no point in taking a shower. I would have to change back into the same clothes. After all, I had to get home. Eventually, might as well have been, immediately. Jean was asleep on the couch when I opened the door, but she jumped up when I came in and said something. I don't know what it was exactly. I still couldn't process what I'd already learned, so my brain just let her words pass over my ears. The way she ran up to me, however, didn't remind me of anything other than the way she jumped up from the table to assure me that nothing bad had happened during James's last visit to our house. Or what I thought was his last visit to our house. I certainly didn't see him again, but what did that really mean? Without saying a word, I squeezed past her, stripping off my clothes as I went and throwing them on the floor. I didn't usually walk around the house naked, but the kids were spending this week with my parents on their farm. At least the asshole died at a convenient time. Of course, Jean and I had to spend this week rebuilding our relationship and maybe working on another sibling for Rachel and Nate. A half-brother? Damn, I felt like throwing up again. I let the water run down my body, trying to get into a state that would allow me to focus again. The only problem was that every time I managed to focus, I felt like I was staring at the sun. It was all too much and yet too little at the same time. I learned things I never wanted to know, but it wasn't enough to tell me everything I wanted to know. She loved James so much that his leaving hurt her more than anything else. It was obvious. Had she loved him so, our entire marriage? Supposedly? She'd never loved me like that. If I hadn't suspected it before, if I didn't remember all those longing looks out the window like in Wuthering Heights, her reaction when I'd caught her crying and put two and two together had finally convinced me of it. She loved him more than she loved me. Did she love me at all? Or was I just convenient? Did it matter? Was I willing to spend the rest of my life with someone knowing I would never be her true love? True love. What a bastard. That's exactly what that smug son of a bitch meant when he joked with my wife right in front of me. Scott, thank you so much for taking care of Jean. I can see how devoted you are to her. She is very lucky to have found her true love. Thanks for keeping me warm, sucker. She's found her true love and it's not you. But you can keep her out of trouble until I come back for her. She loved him. Loved him from afar or loved him in the flesh? In my house, in my bed? Loved enough to become a cuckold? To have me raise his kids so he'd have a ready-made family when he was done with his shitty adventures? I stayed in the shower until the water got cold. I wasn't trying to punish myself. I needed to cool off. With rage, I was ready to destroy the dead man. I couldn't trust myself around a woman who betrayed me with him and other people's children. My children? By default, I assumed. That's how the state would view it. I loved the children. That was the plain truth. I clung to it, to the knowledge that they were mine, that I changed their diapers and put them to bed, drove them to daycare and school, held them when they had nightmares, and tried to teach them right and wrong. That last one I certainly couldn't trust their mother with. That much was clear. I had to cling to that love because I needed to get the truth out of Jean. No matter what she said, my anger grew and grew. I needed that pure love for my children to get me out the door again at the worst possible time. I had never been cruel to a woman in my life. I didn't want to believe it was in my character. But I had also never been betrayed so completely, and a man doesn't know who he is until he's put to the test. I hoped I was made of strong enough material to stay true to who I thought I was. She left clothes for me on the counter while I showered. I tossed it in the laundry basket and went to pick out something else. Now I didn't need anything from her but the truth. When I got downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table again. Always at that damn table where all the worst things in my life seemed to happen. I was going to take it to Goodwill later. Jean was staring into her cup when I approached. She looked up, anxiety and sadness reflected on her face. Scott, I held up my hand to silence her and then busied myself with making coffee. I set out a new serving cup, poured water, and watched the mug as it slowly filled. I leaned against the counter and took a few sips. So, my kids? Her jaw dropped and then she hissed, What? I took another sip. It's a simple question. You're in love with that asshole? The last time I saw him was 9 months before Rachel was born. 1 + 1 equals, are you a cuckolded bitch? I never talked to Jean like that. She was the center of my universe the entire time we were together. Those words were like a slap in the face. It was a tremendous shock, the pain inflicted by a man she had never believed could hurt her. In the last 24 hours, I have become intimately acquainted with that sensation. She stared at me in bewilderment. Answer the damn question. Are our children mine? She shouted, Stop it! Her sadness turned to anguish. Tears rolled down her face. How can you ask that? I would never, I would never do that to you. How can you even think? I exploded at her. Because you were in love with someone else the whole time we were married, you traitorous bitch. What the hell am I supposed to think? That I love you too. I've never cheated on you. I would never have fun with someone else, asshole. I turned away from her and muttered, Neither. What? You said, I love you too. That means you love him. At least you said one honest thing, finally. Assuming it's honest, assuming you're not lying to me about it so I don't ruin our damn lives. Scott, I love you. Of course I love you. I rolled my eyes. Of course. How can you even— Jesus, Jean. Would you stop acting like I'm stupid or unreasonable? My gaze dropped to my coffee cup, not wanting to dwell on the woman who was supposed to be mine. If I'm right, and you still love him, and have loved him the entire time we've been together, and love him more than you love me, then, damn, Jean, how can that be love? How can you marry someone if you don't— I shook my head. Why? Just why? Her tone softened. Scott, please, I love you, I promise. And as for whether I love him more or— She sighed. Please just sit down, I can explain. I snorted. That would be an amazing feat. Scott, you're angry. I get it. I've earned it. I know I deserve it, but please, 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 please let me explain. I really love you. I'm so glad I married you, Scott. I'm so glad you're my husband and the father of my children. Please, baby, just— A growl from the darkness. Don't. What? No baby, or favorite, or sweetheart? No cute names designed to make me have warm feelings for you. Don't try to soften the blow. Just tell the truth for once in our marriage. Jean nodded reluctantly. Sit down, please. I pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. I didn't snuggle against her, didn't want to give her the opportunity to put her hand on mine or sit close enough to smell her sweet scent. I loved her like I'd never loved anyone but my own children, and I knew I was weak before her charms. Fool. That thought, that word made me angry again. Good. My resolve grew even firmer. Good. You said you can explain, so explain. She swallowed, then placed her hands on either side of the coffee cup. Jean closed her eyes, inhaled and exhaled, then opened them. The tears had stopped. Her face still showed signs of pain, but she was more collected. It pissed me off. How could she be so calm? When James dumped me in college, I was so angry. I knew he wanted his ridiculous adventures, dreaming of being another Hemingway, but I knew him. I knew he wouldn't give it up, so I let him go and didn't argue. If he didn't want to be with me, then so be it. He broke my heart, and I thought my anger was hate. I thought I hated him, and that hate was a step toward letting him go. I was single for a long time, dated for a while, met you, fell in love with you. She smiled, but I averted my gaze, angry and distrustful. Yes, Scott, I really have fallen in love with you. Please believe that. I know you're mad at me and— Her voice broke off, the words finding no confirmation. You asked me to marry you, and I happily agreed. I was so proud to marry you. I loved you, and we were going to live a happy, fulfilling life together. I was sure of it. Sometimes I thought about James, but it was always— Jean took another deep breath. I preferred to believe it was nostalgia, or residual anger, or I was internally gloating that I had a dream, and he didn't. And then I felt sad for him that he didn't understand, and I gritted my teeth almost inaudibly. Jean swallowed again, her surprising calmness beginning to wane. I invited him to the wedding not only because he was a family friend, but also because I told myself that I wanted to punch him in the face, that I had chosen another man, a good man, a better man, that he hadn't achieved his dream after 5 years and I had mine, a happy marriage with a loving husband. It was petty, but— She shook her head. No, no buts. It was petty. I shouldn't have cared for him by then, but he was such an important part of my life, and then he disappeared from it. No, he didn't disappear. He was always in my head, in my— She snorted. When I saw him, I realized what a mistake I'd made. All the feelings came back, all the love, the longing. I missed him. I thought my anger had turned to hate, but I was wrong. I loved him. And it's true what they say. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. I, I spat out, "Damn it, Jean, don't try to be nice and just tell me why you— Damn it, if you knew you loved him, why did you marry me?" Her sigh was deep and full of regret. "Because I loved you too. I really wanted to marry you, I really did. And I still do. It's the smartest thing I've ever done in my life. Aside from having our children, it's the best thing I've ever done. Please believe that. Please don't ever think I don't love you. I do, and I am so grateful to be your wife." As for my feelings for him, I convinced myself that it was only a matter of time. I told myself that my love for you would grow. I had 15 years to build my love for him, and only 3 for you. I knew he wouldn't stay, that he had a life of his own, and there was an angry, dangerous note in my voice. "So you're just going to leave me at the altar if he snaps his fingers?" Jean sat silent for a while. "I don't know if I'd leave him then. I don't. I'd like to think I wouldn't, but that's if you look back on almost a decade of experience. But I'm sorry, Scott, I probably would have. If he said he was done traveling and wanted to settle down—" She waved her hands. "I'm sorry. I don't have an excuse for this, or—" Her eyes closed. The next 3 years were some of the happiest of my life. James left for parts unknown, and you and I began our marriage. There were times I thought about what could have been, but I tried not to dwell on it. I wanted to be happy in the life I had, with the wonderful man I had. She shook her head and looked at me again. No, no, I was happy. But then he came along, and I realized it wasn't enough. We weren't enough. If he, like you said, if he snapped his fingers, I was afraid I would have left with him. It wasn't even lust. I told you, and I was honest, that there was never anything physical between James and me. Not once, in all the time you and I were together. But there was. There was a sense of closure. I can't explain it. 7. When we were sitting together, I told him I wished things had been different. There was impatience on his face, sort of. But also, I'd known him for a long time, and I knew he was going to tell me that he wasn't done traveling yet. But he realized he had me, and he was trying to keep me hooked. The expression on Jean's face turned grim. And then you walked in, and I saw your face, and there was resentment and jealousy on it. And I compared it to his face, the face of a man who had seen that he could make my head spin and reveled in it. And I realized what a mistake I was making. I couldn't. I wouldn't throw away what you and I had because of one fantasy. I snorted. And yet, her voice sounded so muffled when she spoke next. I wish I had met you first. I wish I'd grown up with you. You— She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. You're so good. I wish— You're everything I should want. I want you so badly. And I love you. I love you. Coldness filled my voice. I've just never loved as much as I deserve. Jean's gaze avoided mine. The look on her face was undeniably guilty. Why did you— God, why couldn't you just let me go? Why did you— If you're telling the truth, if Rachel isn't his and— Her eyes stopped on mine, anger blazing in them. She's yours. They're both. I've never been unfaithful to you. Not once. I've never been faithful. What? I looked at her with contempt. You've never been faithful to me, Jean. Not really. By refusing to entertain everyone else. It doesn't say refusing to entertain everyone else. When you turned your back, were you abandoning him or me? When you thought about wishing he was the man you wanted, and then what happened? Do you think you honored me? Honored our vows? I'm not even going to ask if you fantasized about him when we were in bed together. We both know the answer. The question is whether you fantasized about him. Is that fidelity? Cherishing me? She didn't answer. I knew from her eyes that she couldn't. Not if she had any hope of keeping her husband. Why did you trap me in this marriage, Jean? Why didn't you just let me go and find someone who could love me the way I deserve? I know it's your fantasy, this domestic goddess of yours, just like his stupid trip around the world that got him killed. I chuckled. And how did that bastard ever manage to get away with it? She looked away, tears in her eyes. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that tactless of me? Asking how the love of your life died? How cruel. How thoughtless. A wicked grin escaped my lips. God, I hope it was agonizing. I hope he died screaming, and I hope it took a long, long time. Jean couldn't hide her shock, but she didn't lash out. Instead, she moved on to the original question, the answer to which was less painful. I wasn't trying to trap you. I knew you loved me. I knew that. She closed her eyes again. I knew you were as devoted to me as I was to him. Maybe even more so. I couldn't have my dream, not all of it. He'll never love me the way I want, but with you I can still have a family. With you, specifically you. I wanted to be the wife you deserve, or at least try to give you that. Even if I couldn't love you the way I should have, I wanted to try. Oh, well, that's just fine. I've heard of it, but an unhappy marriage? Really? She exclaimed, What would you do if I left? Would you have just picked up the phone and moved on? Would you have tried to find someone else? Because let me tell you, no matter how wonderful a person is, no matter how beautiful, loving, or kind, no matter how wonderful a father, a provider, it's not that easy. I can't just turn it off. Do you think you can? Honestly? I should have had the opportunity. I'd rather... My hands clenched into fists. You goddamn bitch did to me what he did to you. You dreamed of a husband, children, and a home. And when he couldn't be a husband, you found the next strongest one and pulled me down with you. She stood up, placing her palms on the table. It wasn't like that. I thought I could... I love you. I really do. And I wanted you to be happy, and I knew you were looking at me the way I was looking at him. Do you really think that if I left you, you'd be that happy again? That you could trust someone else, really trust? I broke you because I was weak and stupid and selfish. I broke the best man I've ever met, and I couldn't fix him. And I tried. Jean lowered her gaze. I tried to give you a happy life. It was a lie that was true anyway. All the love I could give you, even if it wasn't as much as you deserved. She snorted. Even if I loved you the way James did, it would never be as much as you deserved. But I could give you a happy home. Children who... That, I thought, would make us both happy. I've convinced you that you're the only... No, I'm not the only one. What? She threw her head up. I saw you. I suspected, when you were looking off into the distance, that... I sank into the chair, so tired. You were never as good an actor as you thought you were. I always suspected as much, but when we had kids, what was I supposed to do? I wasn't going to leave them, and it was only suspicion, not proof, until I came home and you were sobbing over that worthless asshole who broke your heart. No, you're just saying that. You're angry, and I understand that, but if... No, please, no. She covered her face with her hands. Oh God, Scott. Oh God. I stood up. I wish I'd never met you, Jean, because now I have 2 children I love. From you, from a woman I never should have married. And I'm stuck with you, no matter what I do. I love you. You're right about that. And maybe you broke me by the time we had them. Maybe I'll never be able to love or trust again, but now I don't stand a chance. So I can either be alone or with you. As I turned to leave, she said, Please, Scott, I love you, I really do, But I had already walked away from the table and headed for our bedroom. I gathered my things, not wanting to stay under the same roof with her, at least until the kids came home. It didn't make sense. They were the reason I would stay. I weighed my options, shoving my clothes into my suitcase with anger. Rachel and Nate were going to have their DNA tested. There was no doubt about that. And I was sure there was more to the story, but I wasn't in the mood to hear about it. I nearly turned the table over when she told me about our damn sham marriage and her supposed motives, and I couldn't take hearing any more shattering truths from my love. As I left with my bag, Jean begged me to stay, but I couldn't. I had almost a full week without the kids, and I was going to go somewhere to clear my head. Today was Saturday, so I didn't have to worry about work for a couple more days, but even then I had plenty of free time. But at the moment, I needed someone I could turn to for advice. Someone who I knew would give me good, mostly unbiased advice, even if I hated it. My brother and his girlfriend had been on an archaeological dig for 3 months, so they were out of the picture. There were still a couple friends from college living nearby who might come over, but I already knew where they were coming and why. Warren was too flighty. Adult responsibilities rolled off his back like water off a duck. Bobby, though he wasn't a bad, tough guy overall, was so unsuccessful in matters of his personal life that it hurt. There was only one option left. Scott? Henry's cheerful voice lifted my spirits, as did his huge bear hug. He was a big beast, with a barrel chest and hands the size of catcher's mitts, but he also possessed one of the sharpest minds I'd ever known. Of all my friends, he was the best candidate for good, well-reasoned advice. Plus, he had a spare room. We sat down in his living room and had a couple beers each, just chatting at first. He was a professor, never married, but popular with the ladies. Henry had fallen in love before. He had almost married once. But his heart belonged to science. He aspired to status and didn't want to move when his longtime girlfriend's career took off. At first, he seemed perplexed as to why I needed his advice about marital discord. But when I explained the situation to him, conflicting loves and missed opportunities, he nodded understandingly. Henry smoked a pipe because of course he did. He loved the trappings of being a professor almost as much as he loved the work itself. Puffing his pipe thoughtfully, he asked, "So do you believe her claim that she was never physically unfaithful?" "I don't know. I think, in a way, if she was just having fun with him, it would be easier. If it was a long-standing affair, I'd kick her to the curb. If it was a stupid one-off incident where she got drunk or pissed off, or just made a bad choice, then maybe we'd still have a chance, but this—" I shrugged. "We'll assume it's true for now. If it's not, especially if the kids are his and not mine, I know exactly what I'll do. But if it's just—" An involuntary laugh burst out. "Simple. Oh, it's simple that my wife always wanted to be married to someone else. It's just that my whole marriage was a lie." He raised one furry eyebrow. "Really? What? If she was in love with someone else all along, then of course it was." Henry tilted his head to one side. "Suppose circumstances had turned out a little differently. What if you had married a widow who pines for a man she can never get back, but wants to move on with her life? What if you'd known you'd be second best to a dead man?" "Then I would have known that. If I knew I'd always be second to James or a dead man, I wouldn't have married her. And if you didn't know, if she kept it from you until she couldn't, and that man was never a real threat to your marriage, what then?" I took a sip and wondered. But that's a different matter, isn't it? You're talking about a widow, a man who was married to a man who was devoted to him and then lost him. And this one, she spent our marriage pursuing a man who rejected her. And then having failed to achieve him, she settled for me. He clicked his tongue. Not the same, of course, but not that much different either. If he married her and then enlisted and went to war, that would count, wouldn't it? If he had dismissed his wife's concerns for his safety and accepted duty instead? Jean and James might never have married, but according to you, her family thought it was predestined. It doesn't make any difference. He wasn't dead. She wasn't a widow. She was pining for a guy who was still out there and could have easily taken her if he'd wanted to. Henry held up his hand. No, that was awful of her. I don't agree with it. She shouldn't have put herself and you in that position, knowing what she knows now. But if what she said was true, that she loved you, and hoped that that love could eclipse the love she felt for him. He puffed on his pipe. If you give Jean credit for making the wrong bet on the future, betting that she could love you the way you all agreed she should have, what then? What do you mean? She made the wrong bet. It didn't come true. But she loves you, and the man who was a threat to your marriage is gone. You have children together. Is love that isn't what it should be enough? There have been many happy marriages when the love between two people was not, shall we say, equal. You share a common history and— My seething rage burst out. A shared history that she wanted to share with someone else, Hank. This isn't some political marriage we both entered into out of convenience. I loved her with all my heart. But she— Sighing, I leaned back in my chair. She went along with it, only pretending to do the same thing. That's all? The words flew out of my mouth. The fruit of the poison tree? I snapped my fingers. Yes, that's exactly right. That ruined everything that followed. Henry raised an eyebrow. Not even the kids? Sighing, I admitted, No, not the kids. I love them. But now I'm stuck with her because of them. I wouldn't trade them, but even now, even if I leave her— Shaking my head, I muttered, I'll always know that she left them with me for her own shitty reasons, not because she loved me. Even if she did love me in part, It was all mixed up with guilt over what she did to me by marrying me. Or because she wanted to have children and I was the man she married. Not because— My hand gripped the bottle tightly. In a calm, non-judgmental tone, he asked, "If you didn't have children, what would you have done? Would you abandon her? Or is she right and you love her too much to let her go?" "I don't know. I'd probably leave, but I don't know if pride says it or—" I rubbed my temples. None of this was making things any clearer. She was a good wife, at least outwardly. I suspected she still loved him, but I didn't know how deeply. And if I'd only suspected, and he never came back, I'd have no reason to leave. But now— I waved my hands. "I just don't know. That's why I needed to talk to you." "Hmm. Quite." Another puff on the tube. "Let's approach this from the other side. Let's say you break up with Jean and eventually find someone else. She falls in love with you and you take care of her. You may even love her. However, you realize that you can never love her as much as you loved Jean. So what do? Jesus, Hank, I don't know. I guess— Hell, if she loved me, I'd let her know that I'm still hung up on my ex and that I love her, but not for long, and let her decide for herself." He looked at me. "Is that something you know you should do, or something you would actually do? Or is it something you'd only do now that you know what it's like to be on the other side of the equation?" "Screw you." I couldn't contain the laughter in my voice. "You know, you should have made it easier, not harder." "Yeah, but at my own pace." His chuckle was a deep bass. "But I like to hear myself talk, too." "Obviously." Ignoring the teasing, he continued. "You also need to think about how this will affect Nathan and Rachel. Will you be able to trick them into believing everything is okay? Before this revelation, you had no beef with Jean. She's kept her farce going for a long time, at least in part because according to her, it's not really a farce. Will you be able to do the same? Especially since Jean is likely to be more affectionate, both emotionally and physically. More feminine, to say the least, than before. Given that and your own affection, will you be able to hide the offense well enough for your children?" I pondered the question for a moment, then said slowly, "Perhaps. I'm angry with her now, and I'll probably stay that way for a while longer. I'm heartbroken, and I don't know if that will ever change, but maybe I can keep it up, at least until they go to college. Then you have a few options. You can stay with her and do your best to ignore what you know now. You can divorce her and hope you find someone to replace her, which I think we both know is unlikely. Or you can break up with her and remain single. Each of those options will affect your children differently." "And what do you suggest, Professor?" He laughed. "Oh no, you're not going to shift that onto me. What if you were in my shoes?" Henry shrugged, his expression bittersweet. "I made my choice and pursued my passion a long time ago. Sometimes I regretted it, but never regretted it enough to do otherwise. However, I am not you." We talked until late afternoon, but not so much about my situation anymore. He and I chatted a bit, watched some soccer, and gossiped about our old classmates. It was great. An island of normal human companionship in the middle of the storm. When I went to bed that night, I actually slept well, which surprised me. I was even more surprised when I woke up the next morning with a clear head and a definite direction. Homeland? Hank smirked behind my back as I packed up the next morning. Or off to new horizons? Home. Well, home for now, I guess. Forever or just for now? I zipped up the zipper on my suitcase. That depends on what Jean has to say about certain things. Probably not forever. For a while, probably until Nate goes to college. God, 12 years or so? I can't be a part-time dad for 12 years. I felt a small lump in my throat. A lot of this, it's all so hard. He put one massive paw on my shoulder. Hang in there, Scott. If anything, I think you're making the right decision. You're a good man, and you have good kids. You and Jean are both great parents, no matter how mad you are at her. I nodded, and he gave me another hug before picking up my suitcase and walking me to my car. I waved as I drove away, but my thoughts were on home. To home and to my wife, the woman I loved. She was a real bitch. I still loved Jean. She was right in that if I left her, it was unlikely I'd ever find a man I'd love half as much. And after that, I was just as unsure I could trust her again. Nevertheless, I had some things to figure out before I went ahead with the plan I devised after my conversation with Henry. Opening the door, I found Jean standing 2 feet in front of me. Of course, she had been like this our entire marriage, so why should it be any different? She smiled weakly and stood up from the couch. Scott, please come and sit with me. I can prove that I was faithful to you the whole time we were together. I looked at her and she lowered her gaze to her hands. Physically, I know. My wife raised her gaze to me again, full of despair. I know it's not enough, I know that, Scott. You deserve more than that. But I can prove at least that. I sat down, but not up close to her. Jean frowned, noticing the gap forming between us, but that was to her credit. She knew how to handle it. My wife brought 2 boxes into the living room, one small, the other much larger. She held out the smaller one to me first. These are all the letters I got from James. They're irregular. Sometimes he wrote every few weeks, and sometimes I didn't get a letter from him for months. I opened my mouth, and an angry sound built up in it. I know, Scott. I should have. Jean shook her head. I should have done a lot of things differently. She continued, trying not to interrupt the conversation. You can see that they're love letters, in a way. They talk about a lot of things, about how he's coming back for me, about his plans for us, about, in general. But you see, he never talks about seeing me after that time you caught us talking in the house and between our wedding and afterward. I scoff. So what? You could selectively delete the ones that talk about you having fun with him. Her face turns red. I haven't deleted any. There are some that. Jean closed her eyes. They talk about how we were younger, what he was like back then. I sent him some letters, but not as many, and not as affectionate as the ones he sent me. I told him that I couldn't be his, that I wouldn't leave the children or you. Interesting wording, sweetheart. She frowned deeply. I didn't mean. She growled. Damn it, Scott. I've been faithful to you. I tried my best. A nudge from her foot caused the second larger box to topple over, spilling out its contents. Several notebooks. These are my journals. I wrote in them almost every day. You can see. No. Jean stood up, reached behind the couch and pulled out another diary, then tossed it into the pile. I don't know. I don't know what you'll see. I know what I wrote, but I don't know what you'll see in it. I'm sorry, Scott. I'm sorry. I regret what I did to you more than I regret anything in my life. But I'm glad to. I'm glad because I really love you. I'm so glad you're my husband and the father of my children. You're everything I've talked about before, everything I should want. I know I screwed up. I know I screwed up. I tried to hide it from you because you didn't deserve anything less than the best. And that's what I'll give you, if you'll let me. The best I can do. Her shoulders slumped. Just read them, Scott. There are gaps in the letters because. She laughed evilly. Because James was an irresponsible asshole, but I'm not irresponsible. At least not entirely. I've been writing in my journals almost every day and they're all in there. You can see that I was telling the truth, Scott. I stopped lying. I wish I had stopped years ago and we could have faced this together. I was hoping you'd never have to deal with the consequences of my stupidity. But here we are. I love you, Scott. Please, I'm begging you. Read them. It's all there. Everything I've been hiding. Everything I've been feeling. Everything I've wanted. I don't deserve you, I know that. Or maybe you don't deserve me to deal with me and what I've done, however you look at it. But please, Scott, I'll do whatever it takes to keep our family together. You were right when you said this was my dream. But it was yours too. And it still can be. I will do everything in my power to keep her safe if you let me. My wife walked to the door and grabbed her keys from the hallway table. I'll go out. It's not far, just to a little cafe on Claremont. Find the time and space you need. You can call me when you want to talk or when you want me to come home. I pray to God that you do. After that, she left me sitting with the evidence of my sins. I vaguely remembered the boxes that lay in disarray in our closet. Another thing that had been under my nose that I must have missed. I knew she had kept a diary for years, but I had always respected her privacy. I didn't know about the letters. They gave me a rush of anger. I had 15 years' worth of documents in front of me, hundreds of pages of text. Even if I'd had a whole day, I couldn't have read them all. But I flipped through the diaries and letters, looking for some specific periods to start with, those related to Rachel and Nate's conception. During Rachel's conception, James's visit, our confrontation, and her fears were mentioned, but that was it. They only talked for 15 minutes before I got home. He was gone. We'd had a fight. The diary records all of this as well as her feelings for me. Jean really loved me. She was afraid I'd find out how she felt. She tried her best to hide it from me, although her efforts were not very successful. It was just as she said. She even tracked her cycle during the periods when we were trying to conceive Rachel and Nate. I expanded those 2 periods and added a few more. Our wedding, a few anniversaries, our birthdays, a few other special occasions. There were loving descriptions of our nights together, detailed descriptions of her days spent taking care of the house and kids, excited notes when she received letters from James. My wife loved me. That much was obvious. She was even, in her words, in love with me. I found many notes in which she felt guilty on a variety of occasions. As I suspected, she fantasized about James most of the time we were together. She dreamed of what he would be like as a lover, with presumably dozens of notches on the bedpost, unlike her insecure young love. Jean's words showed disgust at the thought of him being with others, but also excitement. She wrote of her desire for him to stay with her. She wondered what kind of father and husband he would be. But other writings indicated that she herself realized how silly all these notions were. I was a much better lover than he was, both technically and romantically. She raved about me as a husband, bragging about my patience and love for our children. In other places, she chided herself for being foolish, for dreaming of the man who had left her rather than the one who had married her. By mid-afternoon, I had many more pages to read, but I had already gained new insight into my wife's obsession and shame. The diaries took a back seat to James's letters. If my wife's diaries were indicative of a tormented woman, the adventurer's letters gave him away as a smug, manipulative cretin. He interspersed marvelous tales of adventure, danger, and excitement with honeyed ramblings about how much he missed her and how the end of his wanderings was near. This pattern was repeated from the very first to the very last messages. Like a street preacher, the end was always near, and true believers had only to be ready for its return. The diary entries made upon receipt of each letter followed its pattern. Excitement upon receipt, wistful reminiscences, flights of fancy, guilt over misplaced adoration, and recognition of his own weakness. James's 5 stages had been repeated over and over throughout our married life. But now that cycle was broken. I sat on the couch and watched the sun sink into the sky. There were still DNA tests to come, but I had little doubt that they would show that the children were mine. I found no indication in her journals that he had returned or that she would leave me for him if he did. She loved her family too much, if not me, to do such a stupid thing. Everything I'd read confirmed what she'd said. I wondered briefly if she'd tampered with the diaries, but they seemed correspondingly aged the farther back in time they went, and the oldest ones were already starting to yellow. Unless she kept a second different set, these were real, and I had all the information I could ask for. But none of this made my onward journey much easier. I sent a message to my wife. Come back home. I saw no point in postponing this confrontation. My anger had turned from incandescent to dull red, and it wasn't going to subside anytime soon, if ever. Jean appeared in the doorway just a few minutes later with a startled expression on her face. The capillaries of her bloodshot eyes merged with the deep green color in which I had lost myself so many times. I looked at her with a solemn face and then gestured to the couch. She offered to take the seat next to me, but a slight shake of my head made her refuse. We sat on opposite ends of the couch while I announced my verdict. "I'll stay," she gasped, eyes wide. "Bye." The smile that appeared stopped, froze, fell. "I'm not going to deprive our children of a father just because you want them to have another." She started to speak, but I silenced her by growling angrily. Don't, damn it. I've read your diaries and his letters, and I know I have the silver medal here. If you could have picked him, but he was more like me, you'd always pick him. You did this to us. You should have burned all those damn letters before you opened them. You knew. You knew how bad he was for you, how bad your fantasies were for us. You mean you tried to love me? Damn it, Jean. You didn't even try to stop loving him. You didn't try at all. I took a deep breath and exhaled through my nose with anger. Well, he's dead now, and I'm damn glad of it. She contorted her face in bewilderment. Who was this man, and what had he done to her loving, sensitive husband? I'll stay until Nate leaves for college, unless you decide to keep mourning your damn fantasy. You have a week until the kids come home. Deal with your shit. If you're still acting like a gothic tragedy heroine by then, I'll leave. I'll fight you for custody of the kids. Maybe I'll win. Maybe I'll lose. But I'm not going to compete with the ghost of that arrogant, obnoxious asshole for another minute. Jean nodded, swallowing several times before she spoke. Just until Nate goes to college? You're lucky you're getting so much. You have no idea how much you've hurt me. If it weren't for the kids, I'd be out the door right now and risk dying alone. I'm not doing this for you. Hell, I'm only partly doing it for them. It's for me. I don't want to be a weekend dad. I would never do that to you. I grinned. Just like you've never lied to me throughout our marriage. Just like you. Shaking my head, I interrupted my tirade. I might have been second in your heart. Hell, I might not even have been that high considering the kids and your fantasies of a perfect home life. Fourth place? Fifth? Never mind. You used to be first in mine. Now you're not. The shocked look on her face hurt me. I pushed that pain aside. It was a remnant of the intense love I felt for this woman who had deceived me for so long. I need to take care of myself because I can't trust you anymore. I never could. But I know that now. Scott, please. She reached for me as I stood up. Hank offered me a place to stay for a few nights, but I want to be alone. I'm going to get a hotel room, but I'll be back on Wednesday. We can try to set up some semblance of a normal house before the kids get back. Do you think you'll have time to cry over that asshole before I get back? Jean looked down at her hands. I haven't cried for him since you left yesterday. I've been crying for you and for us, and for myself, too. Whatever. I picked up my suitcase and headed for the door when she groaned behind me. I wished it hadn't affected me so much. The few days I'd spent in the hotel had given me a glimpse of what I thought life after the divorce would be like. I wasn't a fan of hers. I called the kids every night and had long conversations with them. My parents didn't seem to know that I was separated from Jean, and I didn't see the need to let them know. The fewer people who knew our secret, the better. From what I had read in her diaries, my wife felt the same way. By Tuesday morning, I was tired of living with a suitcase 5 kilometers from home. Part of me wanted Jean to suffer and agonize some more, but frankly, I doubted that would even happen. She was getting her way, wasn't she? I promised to maintain her perfect illusion for a while longer, and I was sure she thought, with unfortunate accuracy if I was telling the truth, that she would eventually return me to normal. I figured I could go home and try to play my part in her little charade. But that didn't happen. When I opened the door to our house on Tuesday night after work, the first thing I noticed was the smell of rot. It wasn't horrible yet, it wasn't completely overpowering, but it was omnipresent. I found the source in the kitchen. The sink completely clogged with dishes, garbage piled to the top, a half-full plate on the kitchen table with flies buzzing around it. I called out to Jean, but there was no answer. This was not like her at all. Fearing the worst, I threw down my suitcase and ran to our bedroom. The door rattled open, and I squeezed in. She was lying on top of the blanket, still dressed in the clothes she had worn on Sunday. She was asleep. Thank God, only asleep. Jean slowly awakened from her slumber when I shook her. Scott? What? A smile, a frown, streams of tears, all in a matter of moments. You're home. I didn't clean up. Scott, I'm so sorry. Let me get up and... She tripped over the edge of the bed and fell to the floor, then started sobbing. Please, I have to, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, sorry. Jean. Make it up to me, honey. Make it up to me, She crawled toward me and I stood, stunned in place. Her trembling hands weakly tried to undo my belt, and she continued her inarticulate one-word tirade. I'm sorry, I'll be so good to you. Anything you want, let me make you feel good. I love you, Scott. I love you, I love you, I love you. I know I'm an idiot, but I grabbed her hands and pulled her to me, finally coming out of my stupor. Jean, stop. Why? She growled in my face. a manic light burning in her eyes. That single syllable burst the dam, and a barrage of self-loathing followed, half swallowed in exhaustion. Why, why, Scott, why do I have to? I'm a stupid bitch who can't love the best man in my life the way he deserves. I love you, but it will never be enough. And you know it now. You know it, 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 you know it. You know I was never good enough for you. For anyone. I was never good enough for James. He's gone. And now you know I'm not good enough for you either. Her eyes weren't just manic, they glowed with utter madness, or weren't glowing. Their pinpoint pupils swam in a sea of arsenic green. Jean! Her head snapped back. Jean? Jean, what have you done? What did you take? She giggled. Pain pills, all kinds of them. Yours, mine, new, old. It doesn't matter. I'm your pain. Take it away. My wife tried to focus on me, becoming almost coherent. Is today Wednesday? Naughty husband. You weren't supposed to come home until Wednesday, mister. And you weren't supposed to find me until then? Set you free on Tuesday, find me on Wednesday. Give you a better life. Another giggle. Then a sleepy sing-song speech. Scott will get a better life, can find himself a better wife. I lifted her into my arms. God, she smelled worse than the kitchen sink. Fumes of vomit, booze, sweat, and urine wafted into my nostrils as I ran to the front door, swinging it open with a hand weighed down by the weight of my love. By the time I got us both into the car, Jean's speech had deteriorated to the point where only her seatbelt kept her upright as I pulled out of our driveway. I drove down the city streets at double speed, trying not to take my eyes off my fading wife or take my eyes off the road. She slumped forward, and I grabbed her arm to bring her back to an upright position and shake her awake. Jean, Jean, don't fall asleep, baby. Stay with me, please. My attempt to keep her awake nearly cost us both our lives when I skidded within inches of a slowly turning truck. After that accident, I focused on getting us to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible, keeping my eyes on her vomiting in my lap. We pulled up to the emergency room, blocking both lanes of traffic. A security guard ran up to the car, but when he saw Jean in the passenger seat, his priorities shifted to calling for help. A resuscitation team with a gurney met me right at the sliding glass doors. I tried to follow them, but a grim shake of the head from one of the nurses turned the guard into a sentry who wouldn't let me pass. Sir, why don't you move the car? It's in good hands, I promise. After parking the car, I sat for a while, shivering and crying. It was partly adrenaline, partly fear of losing Jean. But most of all, my own words rang in my head. Jean, stay with me, please. How similar were the words she was saying to me, begging me to stay. How my wife was begging me to fix what I was sure she could never do. A small prayer came off my lips, for her, for me, and for our children, that she would come back to us, that we would find a way forward. I couldn't make out her form, but I had to hope that we could build some kind of future out of the days of our tattered past. I rubbed my eyes and went in search of news. Immediately, there was nothing to be found. The staff brushed off all questions. After sitting in the waiting room for what seemed like an eternity, a nurse brought me back in. Her doctor, a pale, gaunt man with the last name Essex, was giving me grim news after grim news. Your wife is now in stable condition, but it was a bottleneck. Her heart stopped for a few minutes. If you hadn't gotten her here in time? He waved those words away, and I flinched at that implication. We have lavaged her stomach, but she will likely be asleep for a long time yet. I believe that physically she will recover, but Dr. Essex tried to put on a consoling look, but he failed miserably. This wasn't an accidental overdose, was it? A slight shake of my head confirmed his suspicions. Then at the very least, she needs a psychiatric evaluation. I'll make a note in her chart to keep her safe from any harm she might do to herself. Can I see her? Not today. She needs to rest. He looked me over from head to toe. And so do you, I suppose. Come back tomorrow morning, bring something to calm her down, distract her. I know you have a lot to talk about, but my goal at the moment is to keep her mentally and physically balanced. I nodded and shook his hand. He let me watch Jean for a few minutes through the window of her room while she slept. Her beautiful red hair stuck to her forehead, and her normally pale skin had taken on an unhealthy shade of gray and jaundiced. Shallow breathing and occasional twitches of closed eyes were the only outward signs that my wife was still alive. I didn't want that, no matter how angry and hurt I was. Once home, I set about cleaning up. The level of dirt that had accumulated over several days amazed me, but I hadn't paid attention to what had been going on in the house since Friday night. Was she really starting to give up even then? The note I did not, thank God, find. I had enough self-accusations in my head as it was, and a tortured apology or confession wouldn't have helped. Of course, I had to tell my parents and her father what had happened. Those conversations fueled my guilt even more, but they all promised to help us in any way they could. Unfortunately, none of them lived nearby, so the support was mostly moral. That night I tossed and turned. Neither physical nor emotional exhaustion could overcome my anxiety, anger, and fear to lull me to sleep. I couldn't sleep in our room, that's for sure. She almost died in there, and would have died there if I had come home when I told her I planned to do it. How could she do that to me? To us? While under the influence of drugs, she said she was trying to set me free, but how could living with her ghost be freedom? By the time I took one last look at my phone before sleepiness overcame me, it was deep morning. When I woke up, only a few hours had passed. I dragged myself out of bed and took a shower. Perhaps I should have done that the night before, but I wasn't thinking straight at the time. I chuckled to myself. I still wasn't thinking straight. But I still needed to face the day and meet my wife. When I arrived at the hospital, I didn't see Jean's doctor, nor were there any signs forbidding entry. She was awake, but did not notice how I passed by her window, just looked somewhere in the distance. But when I opened the door and stepped inside, she lifted her head, then turned it toward me and smiled. It was as clear as I'd ever seen it. "Scott, I'm so sorry. I shook my head. "You don't have to be. We can talk about it later." "No, Scott, no. I need to say it, please. Will you sit with me?" Sighing, I pulled a chair over to her bed. "You need to focus on getting better, Jean. And I need to, to..." I stopped. She needed to focus on getting better, like I said. We could talk about it when she was able to. "Oh, Scott." She reached out and stroked my face. Her hand was so warm on my face, it felt like home. A tear rolled down my cheek. "Scott, baby, I'm so sorry for everything." "Don't be." I choked out one word, just one. It was all I could say. Her tears joined mine. "I have to. I love you, Scott. I mean it. I've already told you that I've always loved you, and I do. I just..." She bowed her head. I need help, Scott. I can see it now. What, what I did yesterday wasn't a cry for help. I wanted to get it over with." "Jean," my voice cracked. "I'll make it right, Scott. I promise I'll make it right. I'm feeling a little better already. The doctors talked to me for a while. They're going to talk to you too. They want to put me in a place where I'll be better, where I can think more clearly. It'll probably take a few weeks. I'm sorry, Scott. I know I'm asking you for more than that. You're going to have to look after the kids and..." I laughed. I couldn't help myself. She looked up sharply. Not angry, just confused. Several cruel retorts ran through my head. "If you'd succeeded, I'd have had to watch them a lot longer. Another way to let me down. So you're crazy now? That's your excuse?" But as angry as I was, having nearly lost her, I was thinking straight for the first time in almost a week. But I still couldn't forgive her. Her near death made me focus on how much I loved her and how much I feared losing her. It didn't atone for her guilt. It didn't atone for the pain. But my children needed their mom, and I wanted to try to find a new we from the wreckage of our past. We could only do that after she redeemed herself. So I took her hand in mine, calmed down, and said, "Whatever it takes, Jean." She looked at me almost without understanding, then pulled me to her as close as the uncomfortable position in which we were sitting allowed, and cried into my neck for a long time, repeating with a sob, "I love you. I'll be better." Jean's prediction of a few weeks turned out to be short by about a month. The month and a half she spent in a mental institution was one of the most miserable periods of my life. Honestly, her absence didn't hurt all that much. It gave me time to sort out my feelings about everything I had learned. I tried to keep the details from my parents. I didn't need the embarrassment, and it wouldn't help her heal. Every time I replayed the theoretical conversation in my head, I wanted to book a ticket to Buenos Aires and change my name. Her father seemed to suspect but said nothing. The proximity of her friend's death was too much of a coincidence. The kids came home on schedule. Perhaps it was a mistake, but I missed them. I needed a reminder of why I had tried so hard to rebuild my marriage, trying to rebuild Jean for that matter. While she was gone, they were my anchor. Unfortunately, that turned out to be true in both senses of the word. Having them around gave me strength and purpose. Rachel and Nate's presence brought me joy at times when there was nothing else to do. But they also presented a huge logistical challenge. I had to take on the role of father and mother while convincing them that this wasn't a permanent status change. It didn't help that as the weeks stretched on, I wasn't fully convinced either. I had almost no help. My mother and father were still working, as was Jean's father. Uncle Hank stopped by a few times to give me some time to myself, as did Bobby and Warren, but that amounted to only 2 or 3 hours a week. The rest was me, the kids, and juggling my job and their school to meet their needs. Because of the constant demands, I didn't have time to think about Jean's betrayal or breakdown. Unfortunately, what time I had left was stolen from my sleep. After only a few weeks, I realized that I needed a professional to talk to. Maybe not as much as I needed Jean, but still needed. But what I needed didn't matter much when I had 2 kids to take care of and bills to pay. What I needed didn't matter. That phrase echoed in my head more and more as I waited for my wife to return from treatment. I visited her a few times, but not often. The doctors felt she needed to work on her problems in a safe, controlled environment, away from stressors. Too damn sorry for her. What I needed didn't matter. I needed help with my children, with my pain, with my feelings of helplessness and betrayal. I didn't get it. Jean got what she needed, and I didn't. Our relationship was structured like this. She needed, she wanted, she got. I was getting enough to be happy, but not what I really needed. I didn't realize it before, but as they say, it's true. The problem with rose-colored glasses is that all the red flags just look like flags. What I needed didn't really matter. Instead of healing, I was festering. My love for my children masked the pain so they wouldn't see it. At least I hoped they did. I missed their mom as much as they did. That's what they saw, but it wasn't. Each week I missed her less and less and resented her more and more. And then the day came. Jean was released from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a new life rising like a phoenix from the ashes. Her children nearly knocked her to the ground when she walked through the door, and she held them tightly to her, crying and telling them how much she missed them. But it wasn't the desperate sobs I'd seen before as she plunged her dagger into my heart. It was pure joy, at least until she looked up and saw my blank stare. She hugged and kissed me too. I did it in a way that made the kids feel good. Yay, Mommy's home. Why don't you show her what you did while she was gone? Anything to keep her in my presence longer and see the underside of this hated, loved, needed creature I'd married. Jean turned to look at me as she left with them, and I smiled as best I could. But it wasn't enough to hide my ambivalence toward her. There was a sense of inappropriateness in her behavior in the weeks that followed. That was my most immediate impression. I couldn't figure out exactly how. It was just plain wrong. At first, I thought she was just glad to be home, but it was more than that. Outwardly, she behaved the same way toward the kids, toward me, toward our friends and relatives. Better, I thought, but it kept me on my toes. I couldn't understand why it was this way. Perhaps I would have realized it sooner if I hadn't kept her at such a distance. Yes, I loved her. Yes, nearly losing her had terrified me. Yes, I wanted us to find a way forward together. But the time spent holding the fort after her breakdown, being constantly on the move without rest, giving her the time she needed to heal, while I could only inflict pain, these demands dulled my love, fear, and hope, leaving only a sharp, biting, painful resentment. She had abandoned me. That's exactly how I felt. Once again, I was convinced that her dream of a loving family remained intact, while mine, the dream of a wife with whom I could safely share my life, remained in the background. Once again, we were not partners. Not really. I was put back where I was needed, in the place of a cog in her dreams. Perhaps valuable, perhaps the best she could hope for, but a cog nonetheless. Was I unfair? Perhaps. Definitely. I even knew it at the time. But other than the few days between when she went into the psychiatric hospital and when I picked up Rachel and Nate from my folks' farm, I had no free time. I wasn't thinking of anything. And the thing is, even if I had been thinking, there was a grain of truth at the center of my discontent that irritated until it turned into a huge black pearl of seething anger. Jean told me about her stay in the hospital and how it had helped her, how it had helped her see things more clearly, how she was going to show me that we could get through this together. She talked about how much she loved me, that her heart had changed, that I was the great love of her life, and that she needed time away from everything else to realize that. But when she talked like that, I only had one thought running through my head. What if all she did was give her time to perfect her lie? Before, she thought she had completely fooled me. Now she knew she hadn't. 12 years of living together hadn't been enough for her to dump the asshole. Did she really think I was going to believe that a suicide attempt and 6 weeks of cleanup would do the trick? So yeah, I kept my distance. I still loved the kids, and yes, they were mine thanks to Crick and Watson. Still kissed her when I walked in the door each day, still acted like a devoted husband. But it was a game. I loved her, but I did it almost in spite of myself. I resented my love for her because it was complicit in the abuse of my trust. My damned foolish heart couldn't let go of my dream as well as hers. I hated that she was right. That if she let me go, I would almost certainly pine for her as much as she did for James. We slept in the same bed at night, but nothing more than that. Jean tried to cuddle, and I let her. She realized it was an allowance, but she took what she could get. A small, evil part of me thought, she's always done this, hasn't she? That part, unfortunately, still drives many of my behaviors. We didn't make love, shared almost nothing that involved physical intimacy. Jean tried to take the initiative a couple times, but I couldn't get the image of her fantasizing about James out of my head all those years ago. My body didn't respond. I felt incomplete, inappropriate. Afterward, she pressed herself against me from behind, trying to comfort me. It didn't work. She gave me space and I turned it into distance. She gave me love, and I looked at her with suspicion. She would reach out to me and I would pull away. This pattern repeated over and over for months. I hated her, but saw no way out. I loved her, but I hated her. I hated my love for her. I hated my own weakness. I hated her lies and hated the truth. Therapy helped a little when I was able to start, but only as much as a Band-Aid stuck on bullet holes helps. I was bleeding, and nothing could stop the flow. Until she did. I got drunk. I rarely get drunk. Hell, I rarely drink at all. But the kids were in bed. I'd had a bad week and, well, my whole life at that point. I sat at that damn kitchen table. I never took the time to get rid of it and drank until things got better. That was the plan anyway. But it wasn't getting better, only foggier. Jean touched my shoulder. I fell asleep like that, leaning against the scratched surface and still clutching the bottle of whiskey in one hand. Scott. Her voice sounded soft but insistent, as if she'd repeated it several times. What? Even to my hearing, the words seemed inaudible. Come on, love. Let me take you to... I laughed in her face. Love, that's good. She frowned. Your love is worth about as much as... I tried to stand up but stumbled. Jean scooped me up under her arm and I tried to shove her off. Giraffe, I don't need you. Don't need you to help me. The room spun. She grabbed me even tighter. I said, off. This time I broke free and staggered away from her, backing against the wall. I pressed my back against her, trying to stay upright. Gravity won out. I slid down and found myself sitting on the floor, only slightly elevated. Jean walked over to me with a look of concern and sadness on her face. Scott, please let me help you into bed. Why? Mockingly, I asked. James isn't there. You wanted me to be like this. And now, I can't even think of him because of what you did. Just stroke your fingers while fantasizing about him. You don't need me. You never needed me. The room spun faster and my stomach couldn't keep up. Like I said, I almost never got drunk and I'd never been this drunk. Honey, was all she had time to say before I threw up, flooding me, her, and the floor. She stopped, looked at herself, then at me, and froze in horror. Then she burst out laughing merrily, and I stared at her in confusion. So all the fight drained out of me, along with the alcohol, and as she pulled me to her, I stood up. Jean supported me as we staggered to the bedroom and then to the bathroom. Propping me up against the counter, she turned on the shower. Her hand covered my mouth. "You're drunk and covered in vomit." "Yeah, no big deal. Let me clean you up and you can say whatever you want in there." I nodded. That was a mistake. I opened one eye, trying to focus on her. "You saved me, Scott. Not just because of what I did that day. I was so consumed with what I wanted that I missed what I had. What you gave me. Not just my dream, but this. You gave me a love that no one can compare to. Even when you found out what I did, how I treated you, you were still going to take care of all of us. You were going to stay and pretend I didn't rip your heart out. And you'd do it for our children. And probably for me too. You were brave enough to try to love someone who turned out to be so unworthy of that love, because it meant you could keep your family together. It's..." She leaned her head against me. "Then I decided to end it. Because you deserved a woman who could commit to you the way you committed to me." "Yes. Yes, I did. I really do. I deserve more than to be your whore. I know. I know. You saved me from my stupid fantasy with that stupid asshole. You were the man I needed, but I couldn't..." Her voice cracked. "I didn't treat you like that. Didn't treat you like the treasure you are. But I will, Scott, I will. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I love you." Both eyes opened and I looked down at her, the pallor diminishing slightly. Jean looked up and said again, "I love you." The difference I had noticed since she had come home from the hospital, this wrongness, suddenly seemed right. "You come first in my heart. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but you are and you always will be, for the rest of my life." That was the difference, or at least part of it, the way she looked at me. It wasn't quite the way she looked at James. It was more intense, more hungry, more desperate. There was love in it, deep love, but with a dash of something else, the pain of loss. She had lost me, and we both knew it. The revelations of that day ripped my heart out and her confession trampled it. And yet she continued to fight. I recognized my wife in her eyes. It was the older brother of the one that had haunted me in the days after the wedding and after James's visit when I'd been plagued by suspicion. The twin of the one that stared back at me in the mirror that night in the hotel when I doubted the parentage of my children. It was the look of a man who has everything he wants right in front of him, but who is afraid it's just out of reach, afraid he'll never be able to bridge the chasm to make the person he so desperately loves love him too. It broke my heart, but only in sympathy. "Jean? Shh." She stood on her tiptoes and silenced me. "I know. I have so much to fix. You don't trust me. It, it hurts, but I deserve it. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you that. I'm always going to put you first, above everything but our children. I tried to do that, but it was..." Her lips trembled. "It was showing off. It was. I thought it was enough to make up for lying to you, but it wasn't." Jean kissed me again. "Anything, Scott. I'll do anything to prove it to you. I'll give anything you ask, do anything you wish, sacrifice whatever it takes to prove it to you. If you want, I'll sign a prenup where you get everything. You get primary custody of the kids. I'll give myself to you with no strings attached. You can divorce me." "I don't..." "Jean, why would I want to do that?" She smiled, sadly. "I know you don't want to, but I would do it. And I won't lie and say it's for you, it's for me. I need you, Scott. I need to see the love in your eyes again, to know that I'm the center of your universe. I've heard it said that hell is not flames and agony, but that you are no longer under the gaze of a loving God. That's what it's like, Scott. I didn't know. I didn't know how much the absence of your love would hurt." I nodded, unable to speak, and she continued, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." The shower no longer hid our tears. Her tears poured freely. "If you never forgive me, I'll deserve it. I know that. I have no right to ask you for love after taking it for granted. But if you let me, if I can enjoy this splendor again, I will do anything, be everything for you. I promise you." She searched my face for some sign. I knew what she wanted, but I was in so much pain that I couldn't give it to her. I didn't trust her. I wasn't sure I ever would. But God, I wanted to. Because now I knew what it felt like to feel truly, completely loved. And I wanted her to feel it too. My wife had hurt me in ways I can't even describe. My wife. I whispered, almost inaudible. Mine. Jean nodded, desperately trying to grasp onto any lifeline, no matter how thin and precipitous. Yes, yours. Yours, Scott. I'll always be yours no matter what, even if you can't be mine. You can cheat on me, ignore me, hurt me, anything. You saved me. I'm yours. I'll do anything to prove. Nah. Later, I could write it all off to the alcohol and its effect on my inhibitions, but that would be a lie. I was still feeling the effects of the whiskey. She held me tightly against her, crying with love, grief, and joy. We weren't healed yet, and we won't be healed for a while yet. But that first step back for the first time in months gave her hope. It was enough for the moment. It was all I could do. I say that literally. The alcohol hadn't completely left my system yet, and even getting to my feet seemed beyond me. I looked sleepily at Jean. She smiled and said, "Get some sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." I said, "Okay." Sleep began to overpower me, but I managed to mutter, "I need you." I heard her catch her breath as she sighed with unexpected joy before darkness fell. She came the next morning as promised. My head was spinning, but I remained silent for a while. One night wouldn't heal us, but she made me believe, for the first time truly believe, that we could heal. When she woke up, we got down to business shortly thereafter. In the months that followed, we both blossomed. We both committed ourselves to us and our family. Full trust didn't come until long afterward. Jean had mortally wounded my trust in her, and we both knew it would take time and regular reassurances to rebuild it. She made a series of gestures designed to facilitate this process. Not a word was said about lost love or what might have been. She burned her letters from him, and would have burned the diaries if I hadn't stopped her, pointing out that they documented our lives as well as her weakness, making them valuable enough to keep. And well, she kept one of her promises to prove she belonged to me. That's how we lived until 8 months before her former lover died, when our lives turned to chaos. Things had gotten better. Not perfect, but they hadn't been perfect before. Too many lies lay between us back then for perfection. But things got better. And not only better than at our lowest point, but better than at our highest. She showed me in every way possible that she loved me, cherished me, cared for me. I was beginning to believe that I really did hold the first place in her heart, even though it had been a long time coming. But a little voice nagged quietly, constantly holding me back. "You're only first because he's dead." We talked about it, talked around over and under it, talked until we were blue in the face. There was no way she could convince me that it wasn't true. James's death ruined our relationship, but we rebuilt it as best we could. After his death, however, she was never able to prove to me that my first place didn't come with a big fat asterisk. Until we were visited by a ghost from the past. He appeared on a day when I was working from home. Jean and I both enjoyed those days, especially during the school year. I may not have gotten as much work done, but my morale was up. We had lunch an hour before, and I was trying to finish a project so we could be together before she had to pick up the kids. The doorbell rang, not such a rare occurrence, especially considering the number of deliveries we were getting. However, the scream that came when Jean opened the door was completely out of the norm. I nearly knocked over a chair by jumping up from it and nearly broke a table in the hallway by running around the corner. But as I rounded that corner, I wished I had slowed down. There, in the flesh, stood my nemesis, the little big man who had tried to steal my wife from me, at least in spirit. He burst forward, arms spread wide, ready to wrap his arms around Jean when I came into his field of vision. She stood motionless, unresponsive. I couldn't see her face, but I could only imagine the thoughts racing through her mind at that moment. Imagination and fear. Was her love for me still intact now that it might be put to the test? He saw me and smirked. "Hey, Slim, how's it going? Get the hell out of my house." Not my voice, though those would have been my words. Jean spoke, and the cold fury in her tone helped me shake off my fear. "Get out of my life, James." He smiled at her with the condescending smirk one might find at a used car salesman. "Come on, Ginny. Don't you want to know where I've been? I'm sorry I scared you, but I had to fake my death. It was a cartel story and get out." This time she screamed, and his smile faded, and then turned into something else entirely. into something evil. Don't you dare talk to me like that. She took a step back, but he grabbed her arm. You're mine, Jean. I haven't spent the last 8 months. I started to move, but she slapped his hands before I could reach them. The fury in his eyes scared me. He looked like an ancient berserker, the madmen the Vikings had first sent into battle to inflict as much damage as possible, regardless of the consequences. He yanked his other hand away as she tried to break free. I don't know what he was going to do. Either way, I didn't give him a chance. I'm not a fighter. I'm not sophisticated, I'm not trained, and I don't have the instincts for it. But no one was going to strike the love of my life while I could breathe. No, I wasn't a fighter, but I could still clench my fist. It crashed into his head, distracting his attention. But it was only a distraction. James grinned, releasing Jean from his embrace and turning his attention to me. Oh, looks like hubby isn't such a wuss after all. He reached back, telegraphing a slap that was meant to humiliate rather than hurt. I blocked it with my good arm, but it felt like I'd deflected a baseball bat. The decade since I'd last seen him had added nothing but muscle to his bulldog frame. I backed away as he advanced, trying to find a way to even the odds. She's mine, baby. She may be confused right now, but once you get out of the way, she'll come around. In a week, your kids will be calling me Daddy. A sly gleam sparkled in his eyes. She'll start calling me Daddy a lot sooner than that. One hand disappeared into his jacket and then reappeared, clutching a long, thin object. Jean, run! She rushed away from him. I hoped she'd run through the door, but she didn't. Instead, she ran back toward our room, and my heart clenched. She needed to leave. I needed her to leave. This maniac couldn't have her, couldn't have my children. I might not be able to stop him, but I'll die trying. Almost certainly, I thought grimly. In a way, luck was on my side. James was a cruel man. I don't know if he'd always been that way or if the journey had made him that way. Probably both. The first few blows should have scared me. They scared me, but gave me time to retreat further, diverting him toward the kitchen and giving my wife a clear path to the door if she came back. Gave me a chance to fight back. He realized why I'd let him into the kitchen and laughed. Going to take your own knife? Surely mine is bigger. Jean said I was. I frowned at that barb, causing him to laugh out loud. He took a step back, hiding his weapon behind his back in a feignedly majestic gesture. Come on, you're not getting out of here again. You're going to stay here forever. He was right, I was sure of it. But Jean could be saved. That's all I cared about. That she was gone and our children were safe. I was willing to sacrifice my life for her, for them, and I would do it willingly. I pulled the butcher knife and carving knife from the block, and he laughed even harder. Amateur. Then he lunged forward, mimicking a punch to lure me out. It worked. The only advantage I had was distance. He backed off after the punch, but it didn't matter. He stayed within the arc of my arms, and I punished him for his arrogance. I watched the wheels spin, moving me from prey to threat. The change in status was followed by a flurry of movement. That damn blade was everywhere, pushing me further and further away. It had me cornered, and the knives I'd grabbed for in hopes that they would even the odds were more than useless. I didn't know how to fight, much less with a knife. Only luck and his arrogance allowed me to land one blow, and I felt the sting of many small jabs. I knew I wouldn't survive. It was only a question of when, not if. So I did the only thing I could, the only thing that could give my love more time, wherever she was. Now she hates you. James stopped, perplexed. What? Jean knows what a worthless asshole you are. She'll never love you. She's mine forever. And even if you humiliate me, you'll never change that. He tilted his head and then grinned, raising the knife. That's good enough. You stole her from me, so I will destroy you. I've already faked my death once, and I can do it again. You know, right after I remind her what she'll be missing. James. Ginny's voice stopped his step toward me. I looked past him and he looked over his shoulder. My wife stood staring at him as if trying to destroy the bastard with her mind. But if that didn't do the trick, I was sure the damn hand cannon she aimed at him would do the trick. Get away from my husband. His attention had dissipated, but not enough for me to do anything about it and be sure of it. And I don't think either of us were sure Jean would pull the trigger. Hell, I didn't even know if her father's gift would work. It had been sitting in a box on the top shelf of our closet since he'd given it to her years ago, but I decided to take a chance that he'd focus on her instead of chasing me, and took a few steps away, out of the potential line of fire. Come on, baby, you won't do it. James turned away from me completely, and I put the knives on the counter as quietly as possible, looking around for something more appropriate. He moved towards her, addressing her like a wounded animal. You can't. You know that. I love you, and I know you love me. Click. Jean pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. We all froze for half a breath, and then chaos reigned in the kitchen. She looked frantically at the gun, trying to figure out why the expected explosion hadn't occurred. He growled and shouted, "I will destroy you!" and lunged forward. And I fumbled for the handle of my new weapon. I had more capability than he did, but I had speed along with it. Long legs, a lighter frame, runner's training, and a speed born of primal fear rather than resentment meant that I caught up to my former rival before he caught up to her. That same primal fear was as strong as the speed. The flat black surface of the cast iron skillet pressed against the monster's skull guided it perfectly. James turned to me with fear in his eyes, blazing with rage. I may not have been a fighter, no, but I was a damn good tennis player. Stunned but not unconscious, he took one shaky step toward me. Jean had apparently stopped to consider why her weapon had misfired, turning a modern engineering marvel into Stone Age trash. The butt of the gun did its job. I don't know if it was the force of the blow, the shock of her raising her hand at him, or the accumulated damage, but he staggered like a drunken boxer, took a few steps, stumbled, and fell onto our kitchen table. My wife and I gasped with effort and genuine relief. She turned to me, a weary and delighted expression on her face, and then she said, "I've always hated this table." We laughed, and then she called the police. I ended up having to get more than a few stitches. James went to jail and then to the morgue. It turned out that faking your death to steal from a Colombian cartel was not healthy. 5 months after our last showdown with him, our third and final child was born. We named her Hope. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.